The Cold War, explained in 10 minutes. Have you ever wondered how the world came closer to nuclear destruction than ever before, without the two greatest superpowers firing a single shot at each other? For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global dominance. They built enormous nuclear arsenals, raced to conquer space, fought through proxy wars, and carried out secret intelligence operations across the world. Although this conflict never became a direct war between the two nations, it shaped the modern world more than almost any other event in history. This was the Cold War. Chapter 1. How the Cold War began. In 1945, World War II finally came to an end. Germany had surrendered, Japan was defeated, and much of Europe lay in ruins. Millions had lost their lives, entire cities had been destroyed, and the balance of global power had changed forever. Among the victorious nations, two countries emerged stronger than all the others, the United States and the Soviet Union. Although they had fought on the same side against Nazi Germany, they had never truly trusted each other. Their alliance had been based on necessity rather than friendship, and once the common enemy disappeared, their differences quickly resurfaced. The United States believed in democracy, free elections, and a capitalist economy where private businesses and open markets played the central role. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, promoted communism, where the government controlled the economy and sought to spread its political system across the world. Neither side believed the other system could coexist peacefully. As Europe began rebuilding after the war, both superpowers worked to expand their influence. Western European nations received massive economic support from the United States through the Marshall Plan, helping rebuild industries, infrastructure, and trade. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union tightened its control over Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Europe was no longer united. It had been divided into two opposing political and military blocs. Germany became the clearest symbol of this division. The defeated country was split into occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allies. Even Berlin, located deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, was divided between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. As tensions increased, the Western zones united to form West Germany, while the Soviet zone became East Germany. Berlin itself became one of the most dangerous places on Earth. People living in East Berlin often fled to the West, seeking greater freedom and economic opportunity. To stop this growing exodus, East Germany, supported by the Soviet Union, constructed the Berlin Wall in 1961. Concrete barriers, guard towers, armed soldiers, and barbed wire separated families almost overnight. The wall became one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War. At the same time, military alliances were forming. In 1949, the United States and its allies established NATO, promising that an attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. A few years later, the Soviet Union responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, bringing together communist countries under a single military alliance. Now the world was officially divided, but another competition was already beginning. Both nations rushed to develop more powerful nuclear weapons. The United States had demonstrated the devastating power of atomic bombs in Japan during World War II. The Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, ending America's nuclear monopoly, Soon both countries were producing hydrogen bombs capable of destroying entire cities within seconds. Neither side wanted to start a nuclear war, but neither side wanted to appear weaker than the other. This strategy became known as deterrence. The fear was simple. If one nation attacked first, the other would retaliate with overwhelming force, guaranteeing destruction for both sides. It was a terrifying balance built entirely on fear. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had divided the world into two rival camps. Although no direct war had begun between the United States and the Soviet Union, every political crisis, military alliance, and technological breakthrough increased the tension between them. The world had entered an entirely new kind of conflict. Chapter 2. The World on the Edge. As the Cold War intensified, both superpowers searched for ways to weaken each other without starting a direct war. Instead of fighting face-to-face, the United States and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world. These became known as proxy wars. Countries such as Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan became battlefields where American and Soviet interests collided. Weapons, money, intelligence, and military advisors flowed into these conflicts, while both superpowers carefully avoided attacking each other directly. They understood that a direct confrontation could quickly escalate into nuclear war. But the closest the world ever came to that nightmare arrived in October 1962. The Soviet Union secretly began deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, an island located less than 150 kilometers from the coast of Florida. From there, Soviet missiles could reach major American cities within minutes. When American reconnaissance aircraft discovered the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent additional Soviet weapons from arriving. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath. American and Soviet military forces were placed on their highest levels of readiness. Nuclear bombers waited on runways. Missile crews prepared for launch. Millions of people feared that World War III was only hours away. Fortunately, diplomacy prevailed. After intense negotiations, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States secretly agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey and publicly promised not to invade Cuba. The crisis ended peacefully, but it permanently changed the relationship between the two superpowers. Both governments realized that future misunderstandings could destroy civilization itself. Soon afterward, they established a direct communication line between Washington and Moscow, often called the hotline, allowing leaders to speak immediately during future emergencies. The Cold War was not only fought with weapons, it was also a battle of science, technology, and prestige. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. For many Americans, it was proof that the Soviet Union had taken the lead in space technology. Only 4 years later, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space. The United States answered with massive investments in science and engineering. The competition reached its peak in 1969, when NASA successfully landed Apollo 11 on the moon. Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on its surface, marking one of the greatest technological achievements in human history. Even though the space race inspired incredible scientific progress, it remained another chapter in the rivalry between two competing systems. Throughout the following decades, both countries continued expanding their nuclear arsenals. At one point, they possessed tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, more than enough to destroy the planet many times over. Yet neither side ever used them. The fear of mutual destruction remained stronger than the desire for military victory. By the 1980s, however, cracks had begun to appear inside the Soviet Union. Its economy was slowing, many industries had become inefficient, and maintaining military competition with the United States placed enormous pressure on government finances. When Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet leader in 1985, he introduced major reforms known as glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. His goal was to modernize the Soviet system. Instead, the reforms encouraged demands for greater political freedom across Eastern Europe. In 1989, one of the most iconic symbols of the Cold War finally fell. Thousands of people gathered at the Berlin Wall. Border crossings opened, and families who had been separated for decades embraced each other once again. Television cameras captured ordinary citizens climbing onto the wall with hammers and chisels, breaking apart the concrete that had divided Europe for nearly 30 years. The fall of the Berlin Wall signaled that communist governments across Eastern Europe were rapidly losing power. Just 2 years later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 independent nations emerged from its former territory, and the Cold War came to an end without a final battle between the two superpowers. But its legacy never disappeared. Many of today's military alliances, international rivalries, and global security policies were shaped during those decades of tension. NATO still exists. Nuclear weapons remain one of the greatest threats facing humanity, and relations between major world powers continue to be influenced by decisions made during the Cold War. Although it was called a Cold War, its impact was anything but cold. It transformed politics, science, technology, military strategy, and the lives of billions of people across the globe. More than 30 years after its end, the Cold War remains one of the defining chapters of modern history, and understanding it helps explain the world we live in today.